Well, we are continuing to work our way through the book of Revelation, but before we come to our text for this week, I just want to say a great big thank you to the many of you who contributed on Erie Gives Day. You know, we made an intentional decision this year, given the economic uncertainty that many in our region are facing. We made the decision to not make a big appeal for Erie Gives as we have in previous years. And yet, despite us not making a big appeal and plea for you to give, still you gave. You gave so generously. Over $17,000 received for our church on Erie Gives Day. Thank you for your generosity. That comes at our time that's really important and helpful to us as a church, as we, like many churches and nonprofits, have seen our giving decline slightly during this pandemic period. That extra shot in the arm of funds makes a huge difference to us. Thank you for your generosity on Erie Gives Day. Well, we are coming to chapter 5 of the book, or chapter 6 of the book of Revelation today. And in chapter 6, this is where things start to get really strange. Remember, the book of Revelation, it's a first century document, and it's a type of literature known as apocalyptic literature. It uses images, symbols, and artistry to help the readers or the listeners think about life less linearly and more creatively. Revelation wants to fill our black and white view of the world with color. And in doing so, jar us awake to see reality more clearly and vividly than we typically perceive it. Now, we're in a section of the book right now that begins in chapter 4 with the author describing heaven, the dwelling place of God. And again, the author's not trying to give us blueprints of heaven or textbook descriptions of what God looks like. Instead, he's painting with broad and colorful brushstrokes to help us think more wildly about the God who is indescribable and uncontainable. And remember, in this vision of heaven, God is on a throne, and that throne is in the center of all creation. Now, keep in mind, the book of Revelation, it's written at the end of the first century in the Roman Empire. The book's contents are first heard by citizens of the Roman Empire. The reference point for people first hearing the contents of this book is life in the Roman Empire at the end of the first century. And in first century Rome, who is on the throne? The emperor. In first century Rome, who is at the center of the known world? The emperor. In first century Rome, who is called Lord and God? The emperor. In the book of Revelation's view of reality, who is on the throne? Who is at the center of the universe? Who is Lord and God? That's right. It's the God revealed in the pages of the Bible and made known in the person of Jesus Christ. This is reality. You see how it works. The author of this book takes his listeners' and readers' assumptions about life in the world and he blows them up. He shakes his audience awake to help them see reality for what it really is. And sometimes reality is scary. And as we move into chapter 6, the author's portrayal of reality becomes scary. In fact, in some ways, it's downright frightening. But you know, often it's only as we face the scary realities of life that we begin to find the healing and wholeness we're searching for. You know, if you've ever tried to create a budget for you or your family, you know what I mean, don't you? As you begin to face reality by putting numbers down on paper, often what you discover is that you don't have enough money to do everything you're trying to do. Resources aren't unlimited. And that's a scary moment when you come to that realization. But by facing that scary reality, you help yourself begin to make decisions in line with truth, which ultimately leads to wholeness. As Henry Cloud and John Townsend are fond of saying, reality is always our friend. And the more clearly we can see and embrace reality, no matter how scary it may seem, the better off we ultimately will be. You know, we might want to think about this truth just for a moment completely separate from our study of the book of Revelation. Where is it in your life that you need to face reality right now, no matter how scary it might seem? What is it that you're avoiding? What are you ignoring? What are you minimizing? What are you overlooking? Or in the first audience to the book of Revelation's case, what have you become complacent to? What do you see every day without really acknowledging it? That you need to be jarred awake into seeing more clearly. Where is it that we all need to face and deal with reality as a way of finding wholeness? Well, for the author of the book of Revelation, reality begins with God as made known in Jesus Christ. This God at the center of the universe, exercising sovereign control over the universe. And as we saw 2 weeks ago, this God has a scroll in his hand. Now remember your ancient history. In the ancient world, people didn't write on sheets of paper like we have today. They wrote on rolls of paper material, often either made of papyrus, a plant-based material, similar to paper, or parchment, thin animal skins that one could write on. And the scroll was sort of ingenious. I'm using this roll of paper towels to demonstrate it because you could unroll one side as you read it while you rolled what you read up on the other side as you were reading. Now, the author of the book of Revelation sees the God of the universe with a scroll in his right hand. And the idea behind the scroll that God is holding, based on ancient Jewish religious literature, is that this scroll, it contains God's plan for the world. This scroll, in essence, it contains the secret to life. God has in his hand the key to understanding all of life and all of human history, which is why the author weeps, remember in chapter 5, when he realizes that no one can open or read this scroll because here before him in his vision is the secret to life from God himself. But nobody can look inside of it. No one can read it. You know, it's like trying to get into an online account that has information you desperately need in the moment, but you can't remember your password. Here, the author sees the scroll that reveals the mystery of life, but it's sealed and no one can open it. Now let's think a minute about these seals. In the ancient world, if you wrote something on a scroll and you wanted to keep it private, keep it a secret, how would you do that? You know, if you wrote a note to your first century boyfriend or girlfriend and you gave it to someone to take to them, how would you be sure the person delivering the note on the scroll wouldn't read it? You know, of course, today you'd send a text message and wouldn't worry about it. A couple of decades ago, you'd put your love note in a sealed envelope and that would assure its privacy. But in the first century, there aren't text messages and there aren't envelopes. So what did you do with your scroll? Well, the answer is you sealed it. And it's pretty neat how this would work. You would take a string and you'd tie it around this scroll. Then you'd take either some wax or some soft clay and you'd put that on top of the string. then you'd take a stamp, unique to you. Sometimes it would be on a ring on your finger. And you would imprint that wax or that clay with your stamp. And this would seal the scroll. Because if somebody opened the scroll, they couldn't reseal it if they didn't have your unique stamp. Pretty neat, right? So when you got the scroll from your boyfriend or girlfriend in the first century with their love note in it, you just looked at the seal and you said, yep, that's Bob's seal. Or, yep, that's Betty's stamp. You knew no one else had looked at or tampered with the scroll. So, the author of the book of Revelation sees in God's right hand this scroll that has 7 seals or 7 strings with stamps on them. And here's what we know from ancient history. That scrolls with 7 seals or 7 strings around the scroll, they were not uncommon at all, especially in important government documents or discourse. So to see 7 seals on this scroll in God's hands, it makes perfect sense to the first listeners of this book. And remember, the author is weeping because it appears there is no worthy recipient who can open the scroll. There's no one who can seemingly open the letter until the slain lamb steps forward. And as we said last weekend, this is a clear image of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is worthy to open the scroll, not because he's betrayed as the conquering victor in this scene, but because he has been slain. He is worthy to open this scroll containing a revelation of what is to come, containing in essence the mystery of life. Now, in chapter 6, the Lamb, Jesus Christ, begins to break the seals and cut the strings. Let's listen to what happens next. And I invite you this weekend to listen to our text instead of reading it visually. We know that the book of Revelation, like many New Testament documents, was originally intended to be heard by its recipients. So let's hear a dramatic reading of Revelation chapter 6, verses 1 through 8, as a way to get our mind around the creative power of what the author is doing in these verses.
Now I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying with a voice like thunder,
"Come and see."
And I looked, and behold, a white horse. He who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. When he opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature saying,
"Come and see."
Another horse, fiery red, went out. And it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another. And there was given to him a great sword. When he opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say,
"Come and see."
So I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying,
A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine.
When he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature saying,
"Come and see."
So I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and the name of him who sat on it was Death. And Hades followed with him, and power was given to them over 1/4 of the earth, to kill with sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth.
So pretty weird, huh? As the Lamb breaks open these seals, one by one, these images emerge, beginning with 4 horses and riders. Now remember, the author told us earlier, he's in the Spirit. He's inside of his God-guided imagination seeing this vision. It's like a dream. And we've all had dreams where we've seen some strange things happen, right? The author's describing what he is seeing as the seals are broken open. These horses and riders emerge. What do they represent? What do they stand for? Well, it's so important to note that over the 2,000 years that this book has been read and studied and interpreted, different answers have been given to that question. Some of those answers have much more probability of being correct than others. And the reality of it is, the book doesn't tell us what these figures are supposed to represent. And we don't have the author of the book here to ask, right? So what do? Well, you do what you do when you read any work of literature that uses images and symbols, which many works of literature do. Remember in high school when you read the Scarlet Letter, or in my case you read the Cliff's Notes on it, and the teacher told you about all of the symbolism in the book, like, the rose bush representing beauty over and against puritanical starkness, and Dimsdale's illness representing his inner conflict and guilt, and the beautiful A on Hester's gown revealing or standing for the beauty in the midst of the scandal. How did the teacher know all that? The book didn't say any of that. The teacher knew that because a thinking mind, when examining the overall context of the book and the setting out of which the story arose, can quickly put that stuff together. It's not that hard. And guess what? It made sense, didn't it? Now, if the teacher would have told you that the rose bush represents the thorniness that would emerge between the Democrat and Republican parties in the run-up to the 2020 election, you would have probably said, I really don't think the author was thinking anything about politics when he wrote this story. It doesn't fit the context. It doesn't make sense. And many of the explanations of the 4 horses, particularly in the last 100 years, they just don't fit. They just don't make sense. They're fanciful and intriguing, but they don't arise from the story or the context. So what does make sense from the story? Well, think about it. All of these horses have something to do with destruction and devastation, don't they? The first horse, a white horse, a conqueror, depicting military might and conquest, which is destructive at its core. The second horse, red, removing peace from the earth so that people will slaughter each other. Destructive, devastating. The third horse, black, portraying famine and scarcity. Famine and scarcity that's made even worse by the fact that while some people are suffering and starving, others are hoarding oil and wine. The fourth horse, pale green, signifying death and pestilence. These are all images of destruction and devastation. Now, it's true that many very respectable interpreters have seen the first horse and its rider as depicting Jesus Christ. And that may be, but it really doesn't fit the context of this chapter. The author is describing destructive forces that people in the first century would have been very familiar with. conquering armies, warfare and strife, scarcity and famine, death and disease. These were all common occurrences in the first century, unless you lived in the Roman Empire at the end of the first century. Now, this is not a completely accurate statement, but follow me on this. If you lived in the Roman Empire at the end of the first century, you lived during a time known as the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. Rome had achieved something that seemingly empires before her had not been able to do. She had created a protracted period of stability and peace that would last for about 200 years. You know, for a lot of people, life was very good during this time. You weren't worried about some barbaric tribe charging over the hill and destroying your home and taking your livestock. You weren't worried about another nation taking you captive. Laws governed public interaction, so you weren't worried about being robbed when you went to the town market. Food was readily available and reasonably purchased. And you know, there weren't plagues like the Black Death that would sweep Europe in the Middle Ages. And yes, people still died, but you didn't have to face that reality every day the way some cultures had to. The truth is, for many people, life was pretty good at the end of the first century in the Roman Empire. And again, my summation is a gross generalization to which a lot of exceptions could be cited. But comparatively speaking, if you were living in the Roman Empire at the end of the first century, life was pretty good. Some would have said life was as good as it gets. And who was to be thanked for that good life? The Roman emperor. It was no wonder people called the emperor Lord and God. He was seen as the source of this prosperity and peace that was being experienced. It was the Roman Empire or the Roman emperor and the Roman system that was making life worth living. And if that was indeed the case, investing in the system and playing the Roman game was the key to success and fulfillment in life. Who needed a mysterious Jewish religion with a supernatural prophet named Jesus when you had Rome? And the scary thing is, even those who claimed to follow Jesus apparently were beginning to think that way. Remember some of the messages to the 7 churches. The author of the book of Revelation says in chapter 6 through his imagery, be very, very careful about your assumption. Be very, very careful about your assumption, because these forces of death and destruction that you're not thinking much about right now are still very real. They are still very out there. You think the Roman emperor and the Roman system has defeated them, but you know better. There is only one being who has ultimate control over these forces, who holds the scroll in his hand, and that is the Lamb who receives from God the scroll and begins to open its seals. Let me say that again in a bit of a different way. You think the Roman emperor and the Roman system have defeated these forces of death and destruction. But the author is saying to his listeners, you should know better. There is only one being who has ultimate control over these forces of death and destruction represented by these horses. And that is the Lamb who opens the seals from which they arise. Be warned, the author in essence is saying. Because you have a decision to make as to whom and where you are going to look for the ultimate source of hope and help in life. You can look to Rome and throw in with the Roman system and play the Roman game, Or you can look to the God who is on the throne in the center of the universe and fall down and cry out, "Worthy is the Lamb who was slain." Boy, do we need to hear this message today. Because the truth is, we live in a time and a place where it's easy to believe that our human system has created a place of peace and prosperity and fulfillment and blessing. And just like in first century Rome, in many ways our system has done that. But then something sometimes jars us awake. We're the victim of a random act of violence, and all of a sudden we realize we're not as safe as we thought. A cancer diagnosis numbers our days, and all of a sudden death is not hidden. We're made painfully aware of the economic suffering of a person we never noticed, and our heart's broken in helplessness. A pandemic undoes the plans we've made and the control we thought we had and the future that we've envisioned. Like Revelation's horses, these realities come as strange gifts because they jar us awake to see reality clearly, to help us see that we are not as secure or content or safe as we thought we were. And these realities drive us to discover the true source of security. The Lamb who opens the seals. Jesus Christ, the manifestation of God who sits on the throne at the center of the universe. He is the source of life, of help, of hope. He is where security is found. The author of Revelation says to his first century listeners, don't put your ultimate trust in the Roman emperor or the Roman system, because there are very real forces, the 4 horses and horsemen, that are beyond Rome's control. And think what the author of the book of Revelation would say to us. Don't put your ultimate hope in how much money you have or who will be our next president. Put your hope in Jesus Christ, because He alone has the power to open the seals. May we heed this first century author's warning. And may we continue to press into our relationship with Jesus Christ as the source from which true life and true security is found.